Have you ever felt like your worship services were stuck in a rut? That's what we're talking about today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Good morning. It's always great to be here with you, Scott.
Oh, thank you, my friend. And today we're going to be talking about worship services and how they can be really transformational. But before we get into that, before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know about a few events that we have coming up. Talked about a couple of these things last week, but it was at the end of the episode. So I know some of you guys like to tune out when you think we're wrapping up. I wanted to make sure that we caught you this time, right at the beginning. We have some exciting stuff coming up in February and in March. So in February, AJ and I are going to be leading two regional one-day events. These one-day events are focused on church health and strategic planning, basically what we do with the Malphurs Group and helping churches get healthy and make disciples. And so if you live in the Tampa, Clearwater area or in the Sarasota area in Florida, we're going to be in the Sarasota area on February 16th at Bayside Community Church at the Bee Ridge campus from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's $30 a person and includes your lunch and materials. And if you're like, wow, I live near there, but I live more north. Good news, we're going to be in the Tampa Clearwater area at Church Experience in the Dunedin, at their Dunedin campus from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., $30 per person, includes lunch and materials. We'd love to see you there at those events. You can register online for those, malphursgroup.com/events. We also have our next guide certification. So we certified a crop of new folks who are helping churches all across the United States. And if that's something that you express interest in, we had lots of people express interest in it, but the timing wasn't right. So if that was you in the fall, or you're thinking, man, I'd like to help churches get healthy, you want to learn more about that, you can also go to malphursgroup.com/events and see the certification event listed there and get all the details. That's coming up on March 7th through the 9th. That is done online. So it's a live event, so it's a lot of interaction, but it's done virtually so that you don't have to travel, keep your costs down as much as possible. And again, that's March 7th through the 9th, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on those days as well. We love 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the Malphurs.
Works well. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Hey, and also, when you're on the events page, you'll see a form down there. If you would be interested in hosting a regional one-day event, having us come to your church campus and invite folks from your city, other pastors, to learn more about strategic planning and church health, well, you can fill out that form and we will get in contact with you and see about making that happen for one or both of Scott and I to be there with you guys and see what we can do in your city. So check that out.
That's right. I want to, on this point, I don't want to get stuck here for too long. I really want to get into the topic, but two things that we hear quite frequently. Sometimes from pastors, we hear things like, I don't think we really need to do any sort of strategic planning. I think we're fine. This event is for you to help you figure out if that's really true or if maybe you have a blind spot. Another thing that we commonly hear from church leaders is, well, I know that we need this, but I've got some leaders that I'm not quite sure if they know that we need to go through some sort of strategic planning and revitalization and church health process. And so if that's the case, then this is a great event that really costs hardly nothing. You can bring them to it and they can hear it and go, wow, I've never thought about these things for our church. And so, yeah, we're charging $30 a person to help cover our costs. This is not something we're trying to make money off of. We just want to serve you and serve churches. So go to malphursgroup.com/events. And if you're in Florida, join us in Florida on one of those two dates. If you're not in Florida, reach out to us and we can get an event scheduled in your area. Okay, AJ. So we're talking about worship services.
Yep.
And I think it's fair to say that sometimes churches get stuck in a rut in what's happening Sunday morning. It's last week feels a lot like this week, and next week will feel like last week did. And we look around, and what is even the point of all this?
What are we here for? Yeah, and even more so as we actually get into the 3 points that we're going to talk about. If you don't think through those points kind of in a new way or from a new angle, they might even reinforce that about you. Like, there's nothing I can change, especially when we get into, in a moment, talking about physical environment. But I think it takes a fresh set of eyes on what do you have to work with, what can't change, and what can change. And I think the churches that routinely maybe shift their point of view, like what could we do differently that would maybe bring all this together in a more cohesive package, or just break people out of the monotony that might make them focus in on what's being presented in a more in-depth way. I think those are the churches that are kind of keeping it fresh and seeing people maybe come away with what the pastor really hopes they will. So I think these are 3 really solid things for you to think about that maybe will shift your perspective.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I think that a common sort of refrain that we hear sometimes is that you change for, I don't want to just change for change's sake. And we don't want you to change for change's sake either. And so we really want to distill it down to, again, kind of getting into what we do in strategic envisioning. We would ask the question, why do you do your church service in the first place? What's the point of your worship service? What is it you're trying to accomplish? And we would tie that into what values are you trying to express or teach or instruct or build into your people through the worship service. And that's going to vary a little bit from church to church, but to some degree, there are always some common ones, one of which, of course, is to lead people into worship. All right, well, drill down on that for a minute, AJ. What does that mean? If you want to lead, does leading people into worship just mean convincing them to sing a couple of songs a week, or does it mean something more than that?
Yeah.
So I think it takes some, if we want these 3 keys that we're about to talk about to mean anything and to actually be transformational, I think it has to start with a discussion with your team and with your leaders to go, why are we doing this? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And if there's a gap between what you're trying to accomplish and your reality, then the 3 things that we're going to talk about today can, I think, unlock your ability to bridge that gap.
Yeah. The last several churches that I've worked with, Scott, whenever we start talking about values, one of the values that we talk with churches out of Acts chapter 2 is the value of worship. So then that inevitably asks the question, what is worship? And most of the teams come down to, well, worship it's everything. It's like how we commune with God in almost every aspect of life. Everything should be worship. And that's the right answer. But I think there ends up being a disconnect then whenever they start thinking worship service, it's like only about the music or something.
Right.
And so if we feel inside, if we agree that we should be worshiping God with all aspects of our life, then you can bring that into like a little microcosm of the worship service itself, which would have to then expand out beyond the music and into the points that we're going to get into, beginning with mastering the environment. This is our first key to transformational worship services is mastering the environment. Now, Scott, there's some beautiful churches in the United States, depending on your denomination. The physical building space might be kind of more of a big deal. And so you may be in more of a liturgical denomination, more of a high church in which the physical space is like really a centerpiece. And then there's a lot, probably the majority of other churches then are very modest, very small. And so what can we do in these great varying environments to still foster this this feeling of worship, this desire to have everything become worship?
Well, again, I like to drill down to the deeper question. So the deeper question when it comes to environment is, what do we want people to feel? And that you maybe have never asked that question as it relates to your church. What do we want people to feel when they walk through the doors? Actually, when they drive onto your campus, from that moment till the time they get back in their car, what is it that you want them to feel? And you could answer this question with churches are going to respond differently depending on their tradition and a host of other factors. But maybe it's we want them to feel warm, or we want them to feel welcome, or we want them to feel the sense of holiness, or we want them, whatever, what is it? And then you want to create the environment that engenders that sense or feeling. So a couple of examples that I like to use, you kind of mentioned a physical space, like a beautiful old building, like walking into a cathedral. It's built in a way that draws your eyes up to the heavens, because that's the point. Like they want your focus and your gaze to be up on the heavens. It's why, very rarely in old cathedrals, even now, they often don't have screens up front, even though they could add those, because they don't want you to focus on those. And even in old buildings, AJ, old cathedrals, the priest would have, stand up on a little parapet, like to give the homily off and to the side. It wasn't front and center, because that was never supposed to be the focus. The sacraments were always put in the middle, because the focus was on that. So these are just details, but I want you to know, like, all of that was intentional. Another example I like to give is Disney. When you go to Disney, like the feeling that you get there is very intentionally crafted to make you feel a certain way. The point isn't for you to have a cathedral or to be Disney. The point is using the resources that you have, using the facility that you have. Are you creating or inhibiting the feeling that you want people to have? So if you want people to feel welcome and at home, but then you walk in and you're not smelling coffee, or you're not or you aren't being kind of helped to find a seat, or you walk in and it's dirty, or you walk in and you want people to feel warm and welcome and at home, but everything looks like a museum. And you're afraid that people might be afraid that their kids will wreck the furniture. That's going to be a barrier to people feeling welcome and at home. So it depends on what it is that you want people to feel. But once you have that question answered, then put everything through that lens. Is our physical space creating that feeling or preventing that feeling?
Yeah. Yep. That in itself is that perspective shift that I think a lot of pastors and church leaders haven't undertaken in a long time, if they have ever. Everything communicates something. So right. You really need, if you don't feel like you could do it, then ask somebody from outside your church, maybe that to come in and give you some first impressions, or ask us. Yeah. We would love to come and do a first impressions evaluation for you as well.
Before we move on too, I want to mention this because I feel like I can hear the podcast listeners going, this isn't important. We shouldn't focus on this. Physical space doesn't matter. I just really want to push back on even the theology of that on a couple of fronts. And I would want to push you to, people will say the church isn't a building, it's a people, it's people, it's not a place. And all of that's true on one level. And on another level, to say then that the place doesn't matter is not a biblical perspective. God gives detailed instructions on what the tabernacle is supposed to look like. What difference does it make to him? I mean, just he has no body. He has no physical form. He doesn't have physical eyes. He doesn't need these things. So it's the instructions for the tabernacle are for us because physical space does something to us. There is a metaphysical connection, but with the physical, there's a physical space can give you a spiritual experience. And God knows that, which is why the instructions are so clear. It's why in the book of Haggai, the people did the bare minimum. They didn't have They didn't have the Ark of the Covenant anymore, so they didn't feel like it was necessary to build the Holy of Holies. But so they have the altar built. They're like, well, we can do the sacrifices. Isn't that enough? And God says, no, you need to finish this thing. Why? Does he need it? Is he so small that he needs a house to live in? Of course not. Because he understands that there is a connection between physical space and our spiritual experience and reality. So I just want to push. I want to push on this very Western American Protestant, almost Puritan perspective that physical space doesn't make a difference. It does. And it's easy, very easy to create a theological lens for understanding that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's definitely something to that. No doubt about it. Because God does care about the depth in which we connect with him and hear what he wants us to hear and feels what he wants us to feel. And your physical space can be a distraction to that. Right. Not only that it maybe is neutral, but it might actually be negative. So, I think these things matter.
That's a great way of putting it, AJ. I think that most people shoot for it neutral.
Maybe so.
Like I think a lot of Protestant churches shoot for the space should have a neutral impact on the worship experience. And I would just contend that biblically speaking, that's not. I think that the Lord is saying, no. There is a role that physical space plays in our spiritual experience.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, we don't ignore this in our homes. We don't be like, the furniture doesn't matter. The paint doesn't matter. The carpet, none of this really matters. How many houses might you and your wife or husband go through? If you're looking for a new environment, how hard is that? Because so much of the details matter. And then why would we think, Sunday, we get together, it doesn't matter. Well,
right.
Whatever.
HGTV would be out of business if physical space didn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
We Flip My Church, new show on
we've talked about this enough, but I want to hammer this home because I do think it's been we carry a lot of baggage when it comes to physical space. And I want to strip all that away and just get us to start thinking about what do we want people to feel? And is our physical space helping or hurting that?
Yeah.
Reality.
All right. That's a fun point. I could talk about that for a while. All right. Our second one is being intentional with the experience. So we've talked environment, we talked physical. Now we're talking the entire experience of a worship service, everything that goes into it. I'm sorry to tell you, it's not just about your sermon. As awesome as it might be, there's much more to it in creating an experience within the environment, from what is printed to what is displayed to what is sung, to the actions and responses that we want people to take. This experience should be cohesive in nature, which is kind of our major point here, is the cohesiveness of the experience to drive people towards a particular understanding and emotion.
That's right. Yes. Everything ought to connect together. I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of churches make is they think of everything in isolation. We have a communion reflection. We have an offering time. We have the music time. We have the sermon. And we think of these as individual elements rather than a cohesive whole. I'll actually give some credit to the people who are kind of high liturgy. One of the benefits, I suppose, is that they do have an integrated approach. They're going to say, here's the scripture for the week and that how that's going to impact the homily and so on. So there's some integrated planning kind of built in. The difference is it's set for you, so you're not picking. I'm just based on my personality and how very Protestant I am. I'm kind of tend to want to DIY the liturgy, but you can apply the same logic in going, everything ought to be integrated. The music ought to be integrated, and the message and the response time and any sort of AV stuff that you're using. You're not trying to create a show. I mean, it's not a concert, but uh, these things do distract from, the message if they're done really poorly. And we've all sat through those worship services, AJ, where you can tell it was thrown together at the last minute. People are not prepared, and it feels it's just bad. It's bad on an objective level. And going back to the point, it's not helping us. It's not building those values, that value of worship or studying scripture or whatever, because they're just distractions. There's distractions everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's definitely elements to the worship service experience that almost are, you can't even really define them in words. I mean, whenever you start talking about feelings of experience, and just the way the whole thing went. I mean, think back on some of maybe the most impactful worship services that you've been to. What were the specific elements that were happening around you for that, or the different features that there may have been as it played out, thinking from scene to scene, if you will, of like the order of worship. Think about the ones that you walked away from like, wow, that really meant something, and then try to bring to a point like, what was it, or what was the combination of elements that made all that work? I think this is another useful exercise. It's also a good exercise, I think, in this case, for people that are planning worship services to go out and experience other worship services from time to time, just to kind of see just what's happening out there in the church. We're not in competition with one another. So, I mean, why not see how God is moving in other spaces and through other people? I mean, we're humans. The thread of time goes through the expression and sharing of ideas. And I think a lot of times our church leaders feel very protective and closed in about, well, it needs to be us, and I don't think that needs to be the case. I think it's good to have a breadth of experiences that would help, trigger ideas, in addition to, of course, just, seeking the Lord in all things. So yeah, step out, check out something else.
Yeah. And I think we need to get away from thinking that intentional to do a worship service well requires a lot of resources, or for it to be very elaborate.
Yeah.
It doesn't require that. It does require you to be intentional, though. Why are we doing this? So that the environment piece is much more passive. It's a lot of work on your part, but that's felt passively. Most people aren't walking in. A person who walks into a cathedral doesn't notice the fact that their eyes are drawn up. You know what I mean? It just happens.
Yeah.
So it's much more passive. The experience part is much more active. When do I stand? When do I sit? What do I sing? What do I listen to? What is it? How do we take communion here? Am I passing it? Do I take the elements one at a time? Are we taking them together? Are we waiting? Are we doing it on our own? Are we passing the offering? Are we putting it in a box? All of those things have to be thought about and communicated really well. Are the announcements times, is it clear, or is it distracting and long and boring? What about our welcome to our guests? Do we do that in a way that people actually want to respond to that and even know how to respond to that? Are we asking them to fill out some card, but we haven't provided pencils and pens for them? Like, all of these things matter, and you've got to think through them. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but it does need to be intentional. And that's the point.
Yeah. Even something as simple as speaking about what you hope people got out of something. I mean, don't miss that. It's a very simple technique that if you're trying to communicate something and you hope they'll come away with it, you could actually tell them what you're hoping they come away with. And I'm speaking about like the lyrics of a song. If a specific song is selected because of the scripture and the topic and the message, it's okay for, a brief monologue or a prayer to call out what it is in that song. I mean, I love this lyric because it speaks to this, and we don't have to make it a mystery that everybody's trying to follow. Like, let me pick up on the clues and see what today's all about. We can just
Yeah.
be open about it.
Right.
But that's again, that intentionality, and bringing that thread all together.
Yep. Which is actually speaking of threads, it's a good way to move to our third and final point.
Clarifying the message. So we've talked about environment, we've talked about overall experience, but at the end of the day, we're there to present God's word in a way that affects change in people's lives. Whether that change is as simple as just them understanding who God is and how he relates to them, or it's an actual life change. But there's something in the message that God has for everybody in attendance to hear. And the more you can build in that message thread throughout the entire worship service, the greater then the takeaway will be for any one particular person in the room. We can't expect everybody to go, wow, that was life-changing. Every single person is different. But God works in his own ways through everybody, and that message could be something that they think about 3 weeks from now, or 10 years from now, whenever they're having a season of life in which it's applicable to them more so then. But clarifying the message so that everything that happens that morning drives towards a central point or theme.
Yeah, so good. And I think that there's a quote. I'm not sure who said it. So maybe
could have been me.
It could have been you. I think it's attributed to some president. So don't hold me to any of this. But there's the concept holds true, which is that the quote goes something like this: If I'm asked to speak 10 minutes, I need a week for preparation. If 15 minutes, I need 3 days. If half an hour, 2 days. If an hour, I'm ready now. And it's this idea that the shorter the speech would be, that there would need to be more thought and intentionality and preparation. And the point I want to make here is that sometimes, and I'm fully guilty of this myself. So full disclosure, AJ can attest to this rather. I think that we often get put in this position where we think we have to sound smart about everything. So we've got to say everything we could say, rather than having the intentionality to think through, what should I say? Not what could I say, but what should I say here? So the point is clear. And I think for those of us, especially who've been to seminary, we really want to sound like we got our money's worth. And so we're going into every single word. We're doing a word study. The Greek word for this is such and such, but the conjugation. And I'm totally, I've done this in my own speaking, and I'm guilty of it. So I'm not pointing any fingers, unless at myself. But I will toot my own horn on something, AJ. I actually was preaching at a church this past Sunday, and there was an 8-year-old who was in the audience, and she was taking notes on the sermon, which props to her parents for even doing that. But her parents sent me a text of her notes, and she only wrote 2 sentences or 2 points, but she got the point. She got the thing that I was trying to communicate. And that, to me, that's the win, that an 8-year-old got it. That to me is what, if I had filled the whole thing, AJ, from start to finish with how smart I think I am, I doubt very much that she would have gotten the point.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that you don't include any of that, or that you aim to the lowest common denominator in your preaching or any of that, but your point should be clear.
Yeah.
And it should be unmistakable. So only use those other things to supplement that point, but it should still be, you should communicate in a way that's clear enough that an 8-year-old maybe misses some of those finer details, but comes away with the point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know what, even kind of tying in to support the whole theme of today's episode, how many times have we heard, our pastor say something about, there's not really a word in English for this, but in the Hebrew, it expressed this feeling or idea. English is a very, very specific language, and we create, seems like, new words every day to be more granular about what the idea is. But thinking
like flu-rona. You heard that one? It's when you have flu and COVID at the same time.
Yes. There you go. When illness would have sufficed for that. But anyway, I mean, the language of the Old Testament was one that was able to convey feelings and ideas or experience, and there may be something to that, of maybe the ability to use fewer words and people still receive the idea or the experience. So there you go. Shout out to the Hebrews for perhaps a simpler language. Doesn't seem so if you're an English speaker.
No, I don't think it's simpler at all. I think it's much more complex. But
they were able to use it well.
The point we're trying to make here, to be clear, is that you should have a point, and then that kind of instructs backwards the other points we've talked about. So start with the message. What do we want people to remember? That's the question I like to ask here. What do we want people to remember when they go to Cracker Barrel after the service with their family? You want them to not forget what you were just preaching on. And so it needs to be distilled so clearly that the 8-year-old can catch it. What is it that you want people to remember? And then let that then instruct the experience and also instruct the environment. And once you know that, it ought to permeate everything. And all of that does not take a huge budget, AJ. It doesn't take a huge staff, but what it does take is intentionality. That intentionality can scale to the smallest church to the largest, and it should. And if we can do that, then I believe that we can have transformational worship services, no matter what your denomination is, no matter where you are, no matter what your facility is, no matter your budget size. None of that matters. If you have the right intentionality behind it, you can have transformational worship services.
Amen. And shout out to Cracker Barrel. You will feel like you're at an old-timey country store if you go.
That's right. Yeah. So. Play the peg game. What's the
Hey,
best
thanks.
you've done on the peg game? Have you ever gotten it all the way down to 1?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've succeeded at the peg game. Yeah.
I don't know. I think I've only ever gotten it down to 2.
It's kind of like the
our international listeners are like, what is a Cracker Barrel and what is the peg game?
It's it's the physical version of Wordle, isn't it?
No, it's not.
You only got so many tries. You're gonna.
That's true.
All right,
okay. Let's wrap this thing up
today. Talking about transformational worship services. This was episode 124. So that means if you're a keen listener, you can go to malforsgroup.com/124 to read today's article on the topic. While you're over there on the Malfors Group website, be sure to go to the /events and see more about what we talked about at the top of the show. We would love to hear from you. If you have any comments, you could throw those in on the YouTube over there because they've got a great comment section. While you're there, also give that a like and subscribe if you would like to see the video version of what you may have just been listening to. Otherwise, you can always communicate with us at leadership@malforsgroup.com with your thoughts, ideas, or questions, and we would love to get back with you on any of those. So thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week.